The sea doesn't forget what's buried in its depths. Rain hammers against metal as an aging mechanic works alone in his shop. The ghosts of 172 souls still haunting his dreams 15 years after they plummeted from the sky. He couldn't save them then. The truth died with them, swallowed by corporate power and perfect lies. Until tonight, headlights cut through the downpour. A woman stumbles from a shattered luxury SUV, blood on her forehead, a teenage boy clutching her hand. In her eyes, the desperate calculation of prey that's run out of options. Behind them, black government-plated vehicles prowl the storm-swept roads. "Please," she whispers, her refined voice barely audible above the thunder. "They're right behind us. Some storms you run from, others you stand and face. And sometimes the most dangerous waters are the ones that appear perfectly still, hiding corruption deep enough to poison generations, and secrets deadly enough to bring down an empire." Rain hammered against the metal roof of Reynolds' Classic Auto, drowning out Fleetwood Mac on the old radio. Frank Reynolds worked methodically beneath the hood of a '67 Mustang, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision despite the arthritis creeping into his joints. At 58, he felt every one of those years in his bones after a long day hunched over engines. The shop sat on the outskirts of Seattle, where the city gave way to towering pines and winding roads that disappeared into the Cascade foothills. Frank had chosen this location carefully 15 years ago, close enough to civilization for business, far enough for solitude. Lightning cracked across the sky as his phone buzzed. Diana, his younger sister, calling for their weekly check-in. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and answered, "Still playing with your toys?" Diana's voice carried the familiar mix of affection and exasperation. "Still keeping society's wheels turning," Frank countered. "How's retirement treating you?" "Boring as hell. Lupus is behaving, though." Diana had stepped away from her federal prosecutor career 2 years ago when her health deteriorated. "Had dinner with Rachel Chen yesterday. She's asking about that witness protection cabin of yours again." Frank stiffened. "It's not for rent." "Frank, it's been 15 years. The Boeing investigation is over. Nobody cares about your cabin anymore." He was saved from responding by headlights sweeping across the shop windows. A black Range Rover careened into his lot, its front end crumpled, steam hissing from a punctured radiator. "Gotta go," Frank said. "Customer emergency." On a night like this, must be desperate. Frank ended the call and reached for the shotgun he kept under the counter. In 15 years, he'd never needed it, but tonight something felt different. The Range Rover's door swung open. A woman stumbled out, blood matting her dark hair against her forehead. Designer clothes torn and muddied, she clutched the hand of a teenage boy who moved with the hyper-vigilance of someone far older than his years. "Please," the woman gasped, her cultured voice barely audible over the storm. "They're right behind us." Frank lowered the shotgun but kept it visible. "Who's behind you?" "Ma'am?" The woman swayed, catching herself against the vehicle. "My husband. He can't find us. Please." Her eyes rolled back as her knees buckled. Frank moved with surprising agility for his size, catching her before she hit the concrete. The boy remained frozen, watching with intelligent eyes that caught every detail, including the shotgun. "That won't stop them," the boy said matter-of-factly. "They have body armor and automatic weapons." Frank assessed the teenager, 14, maybe 15, expensive clothes, private school posture, but with calluses on his fingertips that suggested hours at a computer keyboard. "Inside," Frank ordered, lifting the unconscious woman. "Lock the doors behind us." As they entered, headlights swept past on the main road, slowing briefly before continuing. The boy noticed Frank tracking them. "Black Suburban," he said. "Government plates, but they're not government." Frank laid the woman on the office couch and grabbed his first aid kit. "You've got quite an eye for detail. Kid." "Ethan," the boy corrected. "Ethan Harrington Caldwell. That's my mother. Dr. Margaret Harrington." Frank's hand stilled momentarily. Harrington, as in Pacific Energy. Harrington. Ethan's face closed immediately. I shouldn't have said that. Too late now. Frank expertly cleaned the gash on Margaret's forehead. This needs stitches. You can't take her to a hospital, Ethan said quickly. They monitor emergency rooms. Frank nodded, unsurprised. Military, private security, officially, they work for Pacific Energy. Unofficially, they work for my father. Ethan's voice hardened on the last word. Frank finished butterfly bandaging Margaret's wound. Your father being Victor Caldwell, CEO of Pacific Energy. Ethan watched Frank's reaction closely. The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Victor Caldwell, the man whose company had expanded aggressively after Maxwell Harrington's death 15 years ago. The man whose corporation had built the offshore platform that leaked toxic chemicals into Puget Sound. The man whose lawyers had buried Frank's safety reports just before the Carson Air disaster. Your father and I have never met, Frank said carefully, but we're long overdue for a conversation. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You're not just a mechanic, and your mother's not just running from a bad marriage. Frank checked Margaret's pulse. But explanations can wait. Those Suburbans will circle back once they realize you've gone to ground. How do you know? Ethan asked. Because it's what I do. Frank moved efficiently around the shop, grabbing essentials. We need to move. My truck's out back. Margaret stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Ethan, I'm here, Mom. The boy was instantly at her side. We can't stay, she murmured, struggling to sit up. Victor's team is already looking for you, Frank finished. I'm Frank Reynolds. I'm going to get you somewhere safe, but we need to move now. Margaret focused on him, her professional training visibly overriding her pain. Why would you help us? You don't know us. Frank handed her a bottle of water and 2 pain relievers. Let's just say your husband's company and I have unfinished business. Now, can you walk? She nodded, swallowing the pills. They rammed us off Mountain View Road. They weren't trying to kill us, just stop us. Victor wants us alive. That's both good and bad news, Frank said grimly, helping her to her feet. Outside, the rain had intensified. Frank led them to a modified Ford F-150, its exterior weathered but engine purring with precision engineering when he started it. Down, he ordered as headlights appeared at the far end of his property. They ducked as a Suburban rolled slowly past the shop, stopping near the damaged Range Rover. 2 men in tactical gear emerged, their movements disciplined and coordinated. Military contractors, Frank whispered. Blackwater alumni, if I had to guess. How can you tell? Ethan asked. The way they move. I did 2 tours before Boeing. Frank waited until the men entered his shop, then fired up the truck and gunned it down the back service road, headlights off, navigating by memory. They were a mile away when floodlights suddenly illuminated the road ahead. Another Suburban blocked their path, men deploying with tactical precision. Hang on, Frank ordered, wrenching the wheel hard. The truck plunged off the road, crashing through underbrush. They'll track us, Margaret cried. That's the plan. Frank reached beneath the dash and flipped a hidden switch. Ethan, in the glove compartment, there's a phone. Power it up. The boy complied, finding an older model smartphone. It's locked, Ethan said. 1958-1107, Frank replied, navigating the rough terrain with surprising skill. Ethan punched in the code. Got it. Hit the app called Decoy. The truck bounced violently as they forded a shallow stream, tires fighting for traction on slick rocks. What does this do? Ethan asked, tapping the app. It's transmitting our GPS signal to a drone currently headed east on I-90, Frank explained. Meanwhile, we're going north. Margaret stared at him. You were expecting something like this. Not specifically, Frank admitted, guiding the truck up a nearly invisible fire road. But in my experience, it pays to be prepared. You're ex-military, she said, her analytical mind working despite her injury. But that's not all. Boeing, Frank replied tersely. 15 years ago, I was a senior safety engineer specializing in electrical systems. Recognition dawned in Margaret's eyes. The Carson air disaster. Frank's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. 172 people died because someone buried my safety report. Pacific Energy, Margaret whispered. Frank nodded. 3 board members were on that flight, headed to investigate chemical dumping at one of your husband's refineries. The truck climbed steadily into the mountains, following unmarked roads that didn't appear on any civilian map. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, watching the tracking app as their false signal sped eastward. "Somewhere Victor Caldwell's men won't find us," Frank said. "At least not tonight." Dawn broke over the Cascade Mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks gold. Frank's cabin was hardly visible among the towering pines, its weathered exterior blending perfectly with the surrounding forest. Inside, Margaret sat at a rough-hewn table, examining satellite photos spread before her. The gash on her forehead had been properly cleaned and stitched by Frank's surprisingly competent first aid skills. "How long have you been tracking Pacific Energy?" Frank asked, setting down a mug of coffee. She looked up, dark circles under her intelligent eyes. "Officially or unofficially?" "Both. Officially, my research on marine contamination has intersected with their operations for over a decade." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Unofficially, I've been building a case against them for 3 years. Since the Port Gardner Bay spill," Frank nodded, "when the EPA investigation mysteriously went away." "Nothing about it was mysterious," Margaret said bitterly. "Victor paid the right people, just like he's been doing for 15 years. In the adjacent room, Ethan slept fitfully on a camp bed, his laptop still open beside him. The boy had worked through half the night, his fingers flying across the keyboard with preternatural speed. "Your son has quite a talent," Frank observed. A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "He's been teaching himself coding since he was 8. Victor thinks he wastes his time with it, wants him in business classes, learning to be the next CEO. Not what Ethan wants. He wants to develop environmental monitoring systems, early detection for oil spills, chemical leaks." Pride warred with sadness in her voice. "His grandfather would have loved that. Victor sees it as a weakness." Frank studied her, noting the careful way she held herself, the subtle flinch when he moved too suddenly, not just the injuries from last night. "How long has Victor been hitting you?" he asked quietly. Margaret's eyes flashed. "He doesn't, not physically. Victor's violence leaves no marks anyone can see. Psychological abuse is still abuse. A federal prosecutor couldn't prove it," she said with a hollow laugh. "Trust me, we tried." Frank raised an eyebrow. "We, 3 years ago, I approached a federal prosecutor with evidence of environmental crimes, tax fraud, and corporate espionage." Her voice dropped. "Jason Rodriguez. He built a case, secured grand jury approval. The day before filing charges, he was killed in what looked like a random mugging." "Jesus," Frank muttered. "That's when I knew I needed a different approach." Margaret tapped the satellite images. "These show unreported drilling on protected lands. I have internal memos ordering the falsification of safety reports, chemical analyses of groundwater contamination near 3 different facilities, and offshore accounts used to bribe officials. Enough to put Victor away for decades," Frank noted. "If we can get it to the right people, if they live long enough to use it." Margaret ran a hand through her dark hair. "I was working with someone inside the Justice Department, but our contact protocols broke down 3 weeks ago." "That's when you decided to run," she nodded. "Victor discovered some of my research. He was differently cruel after that. Then last week, Ethan's school reported that men had been watching him during soccer practice." Frank's expression darkened, using the boy as leverage. "The final straw was when Victor told me he'd arranged for me to rest at a private mental health facility. Voluntary commitment. Of course." Her smile was razor sharp. "The papers were already drawn up. So you grabbed what evidence you could and ran. We had go bags ready. Ethan memorized 6 different escape routes from the estate. Margaret's voice caught. No child should have to live that way, constantly preparing for the moment his world falls apart. Frank moved to the window, scanning the perimeter out of habit. Your husband has resources, connections. Why come to my shop? We didn't, not specifically. Margaret joined him at the window. We were headed to a safe house in Bellingham when they caught up to us. Your shop was the only place still open after we got rammed off the road. Lucky coincidence, Frank said, not sounding like he believed in luck. Maybe not entirely, Margaret admitted. Your name was on a list. Frank turned sharply. What list? People who'd had conflicts with Pacific Energy. People who might help if things went wrong. She held his gaze. My father kept detailed records of those who stood up to corporate pressure. Your safety report on the Carson Air electrical systems was flagged in his personal files. Maxwell Harrington knew about me. Frank couldn't hide his surprise. He admired your integrity, said Boeing lost their best engineer when you resigned. Before Frank could respond, his security system chimed softly. He moved to a monitor hidden in a bookshelf, displaying camera feeds from concealed positions around the property. We've got company, he said, tone shifting to military precision. Wake Ethan. Grab only what's essential. Margaret was already moving. Victor's team. No, just one vehicle. Seattle PD issue. Frank's expression was unreadable. Commander Rachel Chen, Organized Crime Division. Police. How did they find us? They didn't, Frank said, checking the pistol he kept near the door. She's Diana's friend. Your sister sent the police. Margaret's voice rose in alarm. Diana doesn't do anything without a reason. Frank holstered the weapon. Let me talk to her first. Outside, Commander Rachel Chen emerged from an unmarked police SUV, her posture alert but not aggressive. At 48, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd earned every step up the chain of command. Quite a drive for a courtesy call. Commander, Frank called from the porch, keeping his hands visible. Quite a coincidence. You disappearing the same night a $500,000 Range Rover gets abandoned at your shop, she countered, stopping at a respectful distance. With blood on the airbag, I'm allowed to take a day off. And the tactical team that tossed your place afterward. They taking a day off, too. Frank's expression didn't change. I wasn't aware of any break-in. I should file a police report. Rachel sighed. Cut the crap. Reynolds. Diana called me because she's worried. Said you might be in over your head. Diana talks too much. Diana cares too much, Rachel corrected. Look, I'm here unofficially. No backup, no warrant. She gestured to her vehicle. Want to check. Frank descended the porch steps. If you're here unofficially, why are you here at all? Rachel glanced toward the cabin windows, where curtains had shifted slightly. Because 3 years ago, I was building a case against Pacific Energy for toxic dumping in low-income neighborhoods. The case disappeared, along with my promotion. And yesterday, Victor Caldwell reported his wife and son missing, possibly kidnapped. Her eyes bored into Frank's. Wife being Dr. Margaret Harrington, the leading marine biologist who's been investigating industrial contamination in Puget Sound. Frank's silence was confirmation enough. I pulled the GPS records for your shop's security system before coming up, Rachel continued. Officially, I haven't seen them yet. Unofficially, I know they were disabled at exactly 11:42 p.m., right when Margaret and Ethan Harrington Caldwell vanished. What do you want, Commander? To know what I'm walking into, Victor Caldwell has half the department in his pocket and the other half scared silent. If I'm going to help, I need to know the stakes. Frank studied her for a long moment. Come inside, but leave your service weapon in the car. Rachel didn't hesitate. She unholstered her gun, locked it in her glove compartment, and followed Frank into the cabin. Margaret stood near the fireplace, her academic bearing at odds with the butterfly bandage on her forehead. Ethan hovered protectively nearby, his laptop clutched to his chest. "Dr. Harrington," Rachel said formally, "you've caused quite a stir." "Commander Chen," Margaret's voice was cool, "I remember you from the Port Gardner Bay hearings, where your husband's lawyers shut down my testimony," Rachel noted. "Yes, I believe they questioned your objectivity due to your daughter's respiratory issues." Rachel's jaw tightened. Respiratory issues caused by chemical exposure from the Pacific Energy plant near her school. The tension in the room shifted subtly. "My father wanted to settle with the affected families," Margaret said quietly. Victor overruled him. Convenient timing. Maxwell Harrington dying just when the liability cases were building. Rachel observed. "There was nothing convenient about my father's death," Margaret snapped, then visibly composed herself. "Commander, why are you here?" "Because Victor Caldwell has filed kidnapping charges against Frank Reynolds." Frank's eyebrows rose. "That was fast. He claims you've been stalking the family for years, blamed Pacific Energy for your sister's failed prosecution of a major case, and targeted his wife and son for revenge." Rachel pulled out her phone, displaying a press release. "There's already a $200,000 reward for information." "He's setting up a narrative," Margaret said, the color draining from her face. "If we're found dead, Frank becomes the perfect scapegoat." Ethan stepped forward, his composure remarkable for his age. "We have proof of what my father's done. Environmental crimes, bribes, strategic accidents that eliminated opponents." Rachel looked skeptical. "Proof that would stand up in court." "Some of it?" The boy tapped his laptop. "The rest requires access to Pacific Energy's secure servers." Frank exchanged glances with Margaret. "We need to move. Victor knows I own this cabin." "No," Rachel said firmly. "Running makes you look guilty. We need a different approach." Frank challenged. Rachel's phone chimed with an incoming text. Her expression tightened as she read it. "Victor Caldwell just held a press conference with my chief of police standing beside him," she said grimly. "They've established a task force to find his kidnapped family." "We're out of options," Frank concluded. "Not entirely." Rachel looked at each of them in turn. "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." The Seattle skyline glittered with evening lights as Diana Reynolds opened her apartment door, her expression shifting from surprise to exasperation. "When I said keep me updated," she told her brother, "I didn't mean bring fugitives to my doorstep." Frank shepherded Margaret and Ethan inside. "We didn't have many options." Diana closed the door, engaging multiple locks. Despite her 54 years and the lupus that had forced her retirement, she moved with purpose, automatically scanning her guests for threats. "Dr. Harrington," she acknowledged, "I followed your testimony during the Maca Bay hearings. Impressive work." "Thank you," Margaret replied cautiously. "Your reputation precedes you as well. Miss Reynolds." "Call me Diana." She gestured toward her dining room, converted into a home office with legal files stacked in precise order. Rachel filled me in. "You've stepped in at this time. Frank, not by choice," he muttered, helping Ethan set up his laptop. Diana studied the boy. "You're the technical genius. I hear." Ethan glanced up, wariness in his eyes. "I know my way around systems." "Good. We'll need that." Diana turned to Margaret. "What exactly do you have on your husband? And why haven't you taken it to the FBI?" "Because the last federal prosecutor who saw my evidence ended up dead," Margaret replied bluntly. "And because the evidence is incomplete, I have enough to raise serious questions, but not enough for an indictment that would stick against Victor's legal team." "Show me," Diana demanded. For the next hour, they reviewed Margaret's files' internal memos, water quality reports, geological surveys doctored to hide contamination, offshore banking records showing suspicious payments to regulatory officials. Diana's expression grew increasingly grim. "This is damning, but you're right, it's circumstantial. Nothing directly ties Victor to the decisions." "That's by design," Margaret explained. He structures Pacific Energy so there are always three layers of deniability between himself and any questionable action. Frank, who had been quietly studying geological maps of Puget Sound, looked up. These contamination patterns, they match the areas my mother's cancer support group identified 15 years ago. Diana went very still. Frank, it's fine, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Margaret should know. He pulled out an old file folder, edges worn from frequent handling. Inside were medical records, news clippings, and a map of cancer clusters around Puget Sound, meticulously documented. My mother died of a rare liver cancer 17 years ago, Frank explained. She lived in Farrington Cove, downwind from Pacific Energy's first refinery. 26 other residents developed the same cancer within 5 years. Margaret's scientific mind engaged immediately. That's statistically impossible without an environmental cause. Exactly what my mother said. She was a high school chemistry teacher, started taking soil and water samples, organized the other patients. Frank's voice remained steady, but his hands betrayed tension. They filed a class action lawsuit against Pacific Energy. I never heard about this case, Margaret said, troubled, because it was settled quietly, with ironclad NDAs. Diana interjected. I tried to get the records unsealed when I was with the DOJ. Hit a brick wall. 2 months after the settlement, I found anomalies in the electrical systems Boeing was supplying to Pacific Energy's offshore platforms, Frank continued. Systems that could fail catastrophically under certain conditions. Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes. The Carson Air flight, Frank nodded grimly. I filed reports, followed every protocol. 1 week later, my reports were declared inconclusive, and I was reassigned. 1 month after that, Carson Air Flight 617 went down in the Pacific. 3 Pacific Energy board members and a team of environmental scientists were on board. My God, Margaret whispered. I was in graduate school when it happened. The investigation ruled it pilot error. Because the evidence that would have shown otherwise disappeared, Frank said flatly. I resigned from Boeing the next day. Ethan, who had been silently absorbing everything, suddenly spoke. I found something in my father's private server. They gathered around his laptop as he pulled up an encrypted file. This is from Project Purge, the boy explained, typing rapidly. It's a contingency plan activated whenever Pacific Energy faces potential legal exposure. The document detailed systematic steps for containing threats, discrediting whistleblowers, pressuring witnesses, eliminating evidence. Christ, Diana muttered. This is an obstruction of justice playbook. There's more, Ethan said, pulling up another file. Operation Clean Slate. It's about Mom. What? Margaret leaned closer, color draining from her face as she read the clinical assessment of her increasing mental instability and paranoid obsession with corporate conspiracies. The document outlined a strategy for having her involuntarily committed if the voluntary approach failed. He was going to drug me and lock me away, she said, voice barely audible. Use my own research against me. Frank placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. But he didn't. You got out. And now we have proof of the conspiracy, Diana added, lawyer's mind already building a case. Ethan continued scrolling through files. There's something called Carson Contingency, but it's under higher encryption. I can't access it remotely. Frank and Margaret exchanged glances. Carson, as in the flight, Diana confirmed grimly. Victor keeps contingency plans for every potential exposure. That file probably contains whatever he has on the crash. A notification popped up on Ethan's screen. Someone's trying to trace my connection. Shut it down, Frank ordered. Too late. Ethan's laptop screen flashed a skull and crossbones image before going black. They piggybacked my access, the boy said, face pale. They know we're accessing the server, and they may have our location, Frank concluded, moving to the window. Diana, is there another way out of this building? Service elevator to the parking garage, she said, already gathering essential documents. But we shouldn't run. It validates Victor's kidnapping narrative. If his security team finds us here, the narrative won't matter, Margaret countered. Diana's phone rang Rachel Chen's number. Victor's security team just requested police backup for a hostage situation, Rachel reported without preamble. They're en route to your location. How did they find us so quickly? Diana demanded. They didn't say, but SWAT is mobilizing. This is going official. Diana. Frank made a decision. We need to split up. Diana, you and Ethan take Margaret's evidence to your DOJ contacts. And you, Margaret asked. I'll create a diversion. Make them think we've all fled together. No, Margaret said firmly. Splitting up is exactly what Victor wants. Divide and conquer, it's his standard tactic. We stay together. They have the building surrounded in 10 minutes. We're all going to jail, Frank pointed out. Not if we're not in the building, Rachel said over the speakerphone. There's a fundraising gala at the Pacific Science Center tonight. Victor Caldwell is receiving an Environmental Stewardship Award. Margaret's laugh held no humor. Of course he is. What good does that do us? Frank asked. Because the Science Center backs up to the Space Needle maintenance areas, Diana realized. And I still have access cards from the Harmon corruption case last year. If you can get there, Rachel confirmed, I can get you into the secure maintenance tunnels. They connect to the transit system. And then what? Frank pressed. Then we take this fight directly to Victor, Margaret said, a new resolve hardening her voice. On our terms, not his. Frank studied her, seeing not the frightened woman who'd stumbled into his shop, but the daughter of Maxwell Harrington, brilliant, determined, and finally ready to reclaim her power. All right, he agreed, but we'll need a distraction to get out of here. Diana smiled thinly. Leave that to me. I didn't spend 20 years prosecuting organized crime without learning a few tricks. The Pacific Science Center glowed like a futuristic temple against the night sky, its distinctive arches illuminated in corporate blue, Pacific Energy blue. Wealthy donors in formal wear streamed through security checkpoints, oblivious to the drama unfolding across the city. From their vantage point in a service corridor, Frank and Margaret watched Victor Caldwell work the crowd. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to power. Handsome in a corporate catalog way, with artificially whitened teeth and carefully maintained physique, he moved from group to group, each conversation calibrated for maximum effect. He looks so normal, Frank observed quietly. Like any other CEO. That's his greatest weapon, Margaret replied. People expect monsters to look monstrous. They had made it through the maintenance tunnels thanks to Rachel's access codes, emerging into the Science Center through a service entrance. Diana and Ethan were positioned near the emergency exit, ready to move if things went wrong. Remind me why we're confronting him at his own awards ceremony, Frank asked, adjusting the borrowed security uniform that barely contained his broad shoulders. Because it's the last place he'll expect us, Margaret explained. And because running hasn't worked. If we're going to expose Victor, we need to shake his carefully constructed image. She wore a caterer's uniform, her hair tucked under a cap, butterfly bandage covered with makeup Diana had expertly applied. The transformation was remarkable from hunted fugitive to invisible service worker. Frank's earpiece crackled with Diana's voice. Police scanner shows 3 tactical units still at my apartment building. Rachel's keeping them contained with jurisdiction questions, but that won't last long. Any sign they know we're here? Frank asked. Negative, but Victor's security detail is heavy. I count 8 professionals, including James Reed. Frank tensed. Reed's here. You're sure? Positive. East entrance. Checking IDs. Margaret noted Frank's reaction. You know him. James Reed was Blackwater, then private contractor in Afghanistan. He doesn't do routine security. He's a wet work specialist. Assassination, Margaret translated grimly, which means Victor isn't just trying to discredit you anymore, Frank concluded. He's cleaning house. Inside the main exhibition hall, a stage had been set up beneath the massive planetarium dome, Corporate logos and environmental slogans created a surreal backdrop for an event honoring a man responsible for ecological devastation. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the MC, "please welcome Senator Harrison Frost, Chairman of the Senate Energy Committee and tonight's presenter." An elderly man approached the podium, his distinguished appearance belying the tremor in his hands. At 72, Senator Frost had been a fixture in Washington politics for decades and a close friend of Maxwell Harrington. "Harrison," Margaret whispered, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. "You know him personally?" Frank asked. "He was my father's best friend. My godfather." "Actually," her expression hardened. "Now he's on Victor's payroll." On stage, Senator Frost adjusted the microphone. "It is my distinct honor to present this year's Stewardship Award to a man whose vision for sustainable energy practices has transformed the industry." Frank noticed Margaret's hands clenching into fists. "You okay? Just wondering how much Victor paid him to betray everything my father stood for," she replied softly. As Senator Frost continued his introduction, Frank's earpiece crackled again. "We've got movement," Diana reported urgently. "Reed just received a transmission, and he's mobilizing his team. I think they've spotted you." Frank scanned the room, noting security personnel touching their earpieces, their casual postures shifting to alert readiness. "We need to move," he told Margaret. "They know we're here." "No," she said firmly. "We stick to the plan. I need to get to Harrison." On stage, Victor Caldwell rose to thunderous applause, his corporate smile gleaming under the spotlights. He embraced Senator Frost with practiced warmth before taking the podium. "Thank you, Harrison, for that generous introduction. And thank you all for supporting the Pacific Science Center's vital educational mission." As Victor launched into his acceptance speech, Frank noticed Senator Frost glancing repeatedly toward a service door. Their service door. "He's looking for us," Frank realized. "Not us," Margaret corrected. "Me. He's looking for me." Before Frank could respond, the lights flickered momentarily, the signal from Ethan that he'd accessed the building's systems. "Time to move." Victor faltered mid-sentence as the massive planetarium projector activated unexpectedly, casting swirling galaxies across the ceiling. In the momentary confusion, Margaret slipped away from Frank, moving with purpose toward the stage. "Margaret, wait!" Frank started after her, but security personnel were already converging on their position. On stage, Victor recovered smoothly. "Well, it seems the universe itself is joining our celebration." That's when he saw her. Margaret had removed her cap, standing directly in front of the stage, her gaze locked on her husband's. The blood drained from Victor's face for just an instant before his training reasserted itself. "Margaret, my God, everyone, it's my wife, she's safe." Security personnel froze, uncertain whether to apprehend her or protect her. "Tell them the truth, Victor," Margaret called, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent hall. "Tell them about Project Purge, about Carson contingency." Victor's expression shifted seamlessly to concern. "Margaret, darling, you're confused. You've been off your medication. I tested the water at Port Gardner Bay myself," she continued, addressing the crowd now. "Found chemical signatures identical to the Pacific Energy spill from their Anacortes facility. The same chemicals linked to cancer clusters in Farrington Cove." Murmurs rippled through the audience as Victor signaled frantically to his security team. "My wife has been struggling with paranoid delusions," he announced, voice laced with rehearsed compassion. "We've been trying to get her the help she needs." Frank pushed through the crowd, positioning himself near Margaret as security closed in. From the corner of his eye, he spotted James Reed moving along the perimeter, hand inside his jacket. "The real delusion," Margaret continued, "is believing you can poison communities, bury evidence, and eliminate opponents without consequences." Security reached them, two men grasping Margaret's arms. Frank tensed to intervene, but a commanding voice stopped everyone. "That's enough." Senator Frost had risen from his chair, his authoritative tone freezing the security team. "Let her speak." Victor's perfect mask slipped for an instant, genuine rage flashing in his eyes. "Harrison, she needs medical attention." "What she needs is to be heard," the senator countered, then addressed the security personnel. "Release Dr. Harrington immediately." To everyone's surprise, they complied. Years of deference to political authority overriding Victor's silent commands. Margaret seized the moment, pulling a flash drive from her pocket. This contains preliminary evidence of environmental crimes committed by Pacific Energy under Victor Caldwell's direction, falsified safety reports, contamination data, bribes to regulatory officials. Phones emerged throughout the audience as reporters recognized the developing story. "These are the paranoid fantasies of a troubled woman," Victor declared, desperation bleeding through his practiced facade. "My wife has been kidnapped, possibly drugged." "Is that why you had men watching our son at school?" Margaret challenged. "Why you were preparing commitment papers to have me institutionalized?" Frank noticed James Reed moving closer, his right hand still concealed. Making a split-second decision, Frank stepped directly into Reed's path. "Not tonight," Frank said quietly. Reed's cold eyes assessed Frank. "Reynolds, heard you were involved. Whatever you're planning, there are too many witnesses." "Witnesses can be managed," Reed replied with chilling confidence. "Step aside. You're not getting to her." Reed smiled thinly. "I'm not here for her." Understanding dawned too late as Reed smoothly changed direction, moving toward the stage toward Senator Frost. "The senator," Frank shouted, lunging after Reed. Chaos erupted. Security converged on Frank, misidentifying him as the threat. Reed reached the stage steps. Victor, sensing disaster unfolding, grabbed the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. Security will escort my wife to safety." A single gunshot cracked through the hall. Senator Frost staggered, clutching his chest, crimson blooming across his white shirt. Reed melted into the panicking crowd as screams filled the air. Margaret fought through the fleeing guests, reaching the senator as he collapsed. "Harrison." Victor was already crafting the narrative, his voice carrying over the chaos. "The kidnappers followed her here. They've shot Senator Frost." Frank struggled against security personnel, watching helplessly as Margaret cradled the fallen senator. Frost clutched her hand, whispering urgently despite the blood bubbling from his lips. "The file, Cambridge Trust, your father's contingency." Margaret leaned closer, hearing his final words before his eyes glazed over. "Dr. Harrington," a security officer commanded, "step away from the senator." Police swarmed into the hall, weapons drawn. Victor descended from the stage, the picture of a concerned husband. "Officers, my wife needs psychiatric attention," he announced. "She's been held captive, possibly drugged. The man who brought her here," he pointed at Frank, "is wanted for questioning in her kidnapping." Two officers approached Margaret, their expressions sympathetic but firm. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." "Victor had him killed," she said numbly. "Harrison was going to help us." "Margaret, you're confused," Victor said soothingly, reaching for her arm. "Let the officers help you." Her eyes cleared, focusing with sudden intensity. "Don't touch me." Something in her tone made Victor hesitate. "Officers," Margaret said calmly, "I have evidence that my husband orchestrated Senator Frost's murder to prevent him from revealing corporate crimes." "She's delusional," Victor insisted. "Check with her doctors. Check with Commander Rachel Chen," Margaret countered. "She has copies of the evidence I've gathered." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, protocol warring with the obvious power dynamics. Frank, still restrained, caught Margaret's eye across the room. Despite everything, she looked stronger than ever, a woman who had finally shed her fear. One of the officers made a decision. "Mr. Caldwell, we'll need statements from both of you downtown." Victor's confident smile faltered slightly. "Surely that can wait." My wife needs medical attention. I'm perfectly competent, Margaret interrupted, and I demand protective custody. My husband has already tried to have me committed against my will. Before Victor could respond, Commander Rachel Chen strode into the hall, badge displayed. Officers, Dr. Harrington and Mr. Reynolds are material witnesses in an ongoing federal investigation. They'll be coming with me. Victor's mask cracked further. This is absurd. My wife was kidnapped. Then you'll want to provide a full statement, Rachel said smoothly. Downtown, now. As police secured the scene, Margaret walked past Victor, pausing briefly. You taught me something important. Victor, power isn't about control, it's about truth, and your truth is finally coming to light. Frank was released into Rachel's custody, joining Margaret as they were escorted toward the exit. Harrison's last words, he asked quietly. What did he tell you? That my father left me a contingency plan, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. In a trust account I never knew existed. Can we access it? Not without Ethan. The account is keyed to Harrington DNA. Frank glanced back at Victor, now arguing vehemently with police officials. He'll fight this with everything he has. Let him, Margaret said with newfound resolve. Some storms you have to face head on. As they exited the Science Center, Diana and Ethan waited in an unmarked police vehicle, faces tense with worry. Mom. Ethan rushed to embrace Margaret. I'm okay, she assured him, though the bloodstains on her clothes told a different story. But we need to move quickly. Your grandfather left something for us at Cambridge Trust. Ethan's eyes widened. The legacy protocol, it's real. You know about it, Margaret asked, surprised. Grandfather told me on my 10th birthday, said if anything ever happened to you, I should find the trust. Ethan pulled out his laptop. I've been trying to hack their system for months, but it's air-gapped. Diana interrupted urgently. We need to go. Victor's lawyers are already calling in favors. Rachel can only hold him so long. As they pulled away from the Science Center, Frank looked back at the building where a man had died and a battle had begun. The real storm, he knew, was still gathering strength. Where to now, he asked. Cambridge Trust, Margaret said decisively. It's time to see what my father left for us. What none of them noticed was the sleek black Suburban pulling out 3 cars behind them. James Reed at the wheel, his cold eyes never leaving their vehicle. The hunt had only just begun. Cambridge Trust occupied the 27th floor of a downtown Seattle skyscraper, its discreet brass plaque giving no indication of the fortunes secured behind its walls. At 7:00 a.m., the financial district was just coming to life, giving their small group a brief window before Victor could mobilize his forces. You're sure about this? Diana asked as they approached the building. Victor will have anticipated you coming here. It's our only play, Margaret replied. Whatever my father left in that trust, Victor's been keeping me from it for 15 years. They had spent the night at a safe house Rachel secured an evidence storage facility technically under maintenance. Frank had barely slept, keeping watch while the others researched Cambridge Trust's security protocols, and Ethan attempted to piece together what his grandfather might have left them. Now, as they entered the building's marble lobby, Frank felt exposed. His weathered appearance and borrowed clothes stood in stark contrast to the polished bankers arriving for work. Mr. Reynolds, you're fidgeting, Diana observed quietly. Last time I was in a place like this, I was being deposed about the Carson Air disaster, he muttered. Margaret squeezed his arm briefly. We're almost there. The elevator opened directly into Cambridge Trust's reception area, where a poised woman in her 60s greeted them with professional detachment. Welcome to Cambridge Trust. Do you have an appointment? Dr. Margaret Harrington to access the Maxwell Harrington Legacy Trust, Margaret stated formally. The receptionist's demeanor shifted subtly. Of course, Dr. Harrington. We've been expecting you for some time. May I see identification? Margaret provided her driver's license. The receptionist examined it, then looked at Ethan. And the secondary trustee? Ethan stepped forward. Ethan Harrington Caldwell. Very good. And these individuals, she glanced at Frank and Diana. My legal counsel and security consultant, Margaret improvised. The receptionist nodded, apparently accepting this. Please follow me. She led them through a series of security checkpoints to a private conference room paneled in dark wood. A distinguished man in his 70s waited inside, rising as they entered. Dr. Harrington, I'm Walter Brookfield, trustee of your father's legacy account. He nodded to Ethan. Young Mr. Harrington Caldwell, you're the spitting image of your grandfather at your age. Ethan straightened unconsciously. You knew him well. I was his roommate at Yale, his best man, and his attorney for 40 years. Brookfield gestured for them to sit. I've been waiting for this day for 15 years, though I confess I'd begun to lose hope. My husband made accessing anything connected to my father difficult, Margaret explained. Brookfield's expression hardened. Yes, Mr. Caldwell has been quite persistent in his attempts to access this trust. Fortunately, Maxwell's provisions were ironclad. He placed his palm on a biometric scanner embedded in the conference table. A panel slid open, revealing a small safe. The trust requires three-factor authentication, Brookfield explained. My biometrics, your DNA verification, and a passphrase only you would know. Margaret looked uncertain. I don't recall my father establishing any passphrase. It would have been significant to both of you. Something personal, not documented elsewhere. She thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. The stars belong to everyone. Brookfield nodded, entering the phrase into a keypad. Your father mentioned you said that at your first planetarium visit. You were 5. The safe clicked open. Inside lay a sealed envelope, a USB drive, and a small wooden box. Before you examine these, Brookfield said solemnly, there's something you should know. Maxwell anticipated that accessing this trust might put you in danger. There are protocols in place for your protection. What kind of protocols? Frank asked. Security instincts on alert. Federal marshals on standby. A secure residence prepared outside the country. New identities if necessary. Brookfield fixed Margaret with a serious gaze. Your father understood the forces aligned against you. Margaret reached for the envelope first. If my father went to these lengths, what's in here must be significant. The letter inside was handwritten, dated just weeks before Maxwell Harrington's death. As Margaret read, her hand trembled visibly. My God, she whispered. What is it? Diana asked. My father wasn't just suspicious of Victor's business practices. He had proof. She looked up, shock evident in her expression. And he knew Victor was responsible for the Carson Air disaster. Frank went completely still. What? Margaret continued reading aloud. The electrical system failure was not an accident, but a deliberate act of sabotage. Victor needed to eliminate board members questioning his Anacortes facility operations. He arranged for substandard components to be installed, then buried the safety reports filed by Boeing engineer Frank Reynolds. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. 172 people, Frank said hoarsely. He murdered 172 people to protect his operation. Margaret passed him the letter. There's more. About you specifically. Frank scanned the elegant handwriting. I've been following Reynolds' career since he resigned from Boeing. His integrity cost him everything. Yet he's continued investigating quietly. If you're reading this, Margaret, find him. He deserves to know the truth, and you'll need allies Victor can't buy. Maxwell knew who you were, Diana said, amazed. He was watching you. The USB drive likely contains supporting evidence, Brookfield interjected. Maxwell was meticulous about documentation. Ethan, who had been examining the wooden box, carefully opened it. Inside lay an antique pocket watch and a small vial. DNA samples, the boy said, holding up the vial, and grandfather's watch. Brookfield nodded. The DNA is critical for the final part of the trust. What final part? Margaret asked. Maxwell structured his holdings to prevent exactly what happened after his death. The voting shares of Pacific Energy were supposed to be split between you and Victor, with key environmental provisions locked in place. Brookfield's expression darkened. Victor's manipulation of your stake violated the terms of your father's will. But we can't prove that 15 years later, Diana pointed out. We don't have to. Brookfield smiled thinly. Maxwell included a genetic trust trigger. If either you or your direct descendant can prove Victor violated the environmental protection covenants, control of Pacific Energy reverts to you immediately. Margaret's scientific mind processed this quickly. The DNA samples are verification for the trust execution. Precisely. But that still requires proving Victor violated the covenants, Frank noted, which would be nearly impossible after 15 years. Not anymore, Ethan said, examining the USB drive's contents on his laptop. Grandfather documented everything. Site coordinates, chemical signatures, health impacts. Diana leaned over his shoulder. This is a comprehensive case file. With this and what Margaret already compiled, we could take down Victor and reclaim Pacific Energy, Margaret finished. Frank wasn't convinced. Victor's already spinning last night's events to make you look unstable. He'll claim this is all fabricated. That's why we need a neutral third party to verify the evidence, Diana said. Someone with credibility Victor can't easily attack. The EPA investigation team that was suppressed after Port Gardner Bay, Margaret suggested. Dr. Eliza Forrester is still with the agency. It would take time to bring her in securely, Diana cautioned. Time we may not have, Frank agreed. Victor knows we're onto something big. After Senator Frost's assassination, he'll accelerate his timeline. Brookfield cleared his throat. There is one more thing Maxwell prepared for this scenario. He produced a formal legal document, a federal deposition, recorded under oath before his death, detailing Victor's illegal activities. It was to be released only if the trust was accessed. That's a dead man's switch, Diana said admiringly. My father thought of everything, Margaret murmured. Almost everything, Frank corrected grimly. He couldn't anticipate how far Victor would go to protect himself. As if summoned by his name, their phones simultaneously received emergency alerts. Armed suspect alert, downtown Seattle, shelter in place. Brookfield's desk phone rang. He answered, listened briefly, then hung up, face ashen. Security reports armed men in the lobby. They've disabled the elevators and are proceeding up the emergency stairs. Frank moved immediately to the door, checking the corridor. How many security personnel in the building? Just 2, unarmed except for tasers. Brookfield replied. Victor's not taking chances anymore, Diana said, helping Ethan gather the evidence. He's making his move. Margaret secured the letter and DNA samples in her jacket. Is there another way out of here? The executive elevator, Brookfield said, pressing a hidden panel in the wall. A section of bookcases slid aside, revealing a private elevator. It runs on a separate system to the parking garage. Let's move, Frank ordered. Diana, you and Ethan take the evidence. Margaret and I will create a diversion. No, Margaret said firmly. We stay together. That's what Victor expects, divide and conquer. The sound of gunfire echoed from the reception area. We don't have time to debate, Frank said urgently. Those aren't police. They're Victor's private contractors. They're here to eliminate witnesses and retrieve the evidence. Brookfield made a decision, removing a security card from his pocket. This will take you to the secure document storage level. There's an emergency exit to the adjacent building. Margaret turned to the elderly attorney. Walter, come with us. He shook his head sadly. I promised your father I'd see this through. Margaret, I'll buy you time. They'll kill you, she protested. Perhaps. His smile was resigned. But Maxwell and I planned for this contingency too. Before they could argue further, the conference room door splintered under a battering ram. Frank shoved everyone into the hidden elevator as Brookfield calmly sat at the table, hands folded. The last thing they saw as the panels closed was Walter Brookfield facing the armed intruders with dignity intact. The elevator descended rapidly to a sub-level marked Document Archive. They emerged into a cavernous room filled with rows of filing cabinets and climate-controlled document storage. "This way," Frank directed, following emergency exit signs. They had covered half the distance when the elevator hummed back to life behind them. "They're coming," Ethan warned, clutching his laptop and the wooden box. Frank spotted a fire alarm on the wall. "Change of plans!" He triggered the alarm, instantly activating sprinklers throughout the level. Document preservation protocols engaged automatically, sealing sensitive storage behind fireproof barriers as lights flashed and sirens wailed. "The exit will lock down in fire mode," Diana realized. "We'll be trapped." "No, we'll be hidden," Frank corrected, leading them between massive document vaults. "The sprinklers will obscure thermal imaging, and the alarm will bring legitimate first responders. Victor's team won't risk exposure." They crouched behind a document vault as the elevator doors opened. Through the artificial rain and flashing lights, they glimpsed three figures in tactical gear, sweeping the area with professional precision. "They're boxing us in," Frank whispered. "Diana, there's an electrical panel near you. Can you reach it?" She nodded, moving carefully through the sprinkler rain. Reaching the panel, she waited for Frank's signal, then threw the breaker. The archive plunged into darkness, emergency lights casting eerie red glows through the water. Using the confusion, Frank led them crawling between document stacks toward a maintenance corridor he'd spotted earlier. Behind them, tactical lights swept the darkness, accompanied by the methodical movements of trained killers. "They're hurting us," Frank realized. "There's another team at the emergency exit." Margaret's scientific mind worked rapidly. The climate control system, archives this sensitive would have independent ventilation, which means ductwork. Ethan caught on, pointing to a large grate near the ceiling. Frank hoisted the boy up first, then Diana. As he helped Margaret, a tactical light caught them momentarily before Frank kicked over a filing cabinet, creating cover. Gunfire erupted, bullets pinging off metal shelving as Frank pulled himself into the duct behind Margaret, replacing the grate. "Crawl," he hissed, "toward the north side of the building." They moved as quickly as possible through the cramped metal tunnels, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant. Ethan led the way, using his phone's compass app to navigate the maze. "There should be an access point for maintenance," the boy whispered, "probably near an exterior wall." After several tense minutes, they reached a junction with a grate that opened into a utility closet. Frank kicked it open, helping everyone down before securing the door. "Where are we?" Diana asked, wiping water from her face. Ethan checked his phone. "Northwest corner of the building, but all exits will be watched." Frank examined their surroundings, cleaning supplies, maintenance equipment, building plans mounted on the wall. "We need a diversion," he said, studying the plans. "Something big enough to force an evacuation." Margaret's eyes lit with sudden inspiration. The chemical storage, cleaning compounds mixed with the right accelerants, could create enough smoke to trigger a full building evacuation. Frank finished, already gathering supplies. "But we'd be evacuated right into Victor's team," Diana pointed out. "Not if we're already outside," Margaret countered, pointing to the plans. "The maintenance shaft, it connects to the loading dock." Frank quickly assembled an improvised smoke device using cleaning chemicals and a time trigger. "This won't cause actual fire damage," he explained, "but it'll create enough smoke to trigger the systems." "How long?" Diana asked. 3 minutes, Frank said, activating the timer. "Move!" They slipped into the maintenance shaft, descending metal stairs as alarms began blaring above them. By the time they reached the loading dock, the evacuation was in full swing. Employees streaming out of emergency exits as fire trucks approached. In the chaos, they blended with the evacuating crowd, moving steadily away from the building. From across the street, they glimpsed James Reed coordinating men in plainclothes, his cold eyes scanning the crowd methodically. "Don't look back," Frank murmured. "Keep moving naturally." They had almost reached the corner when Reed's gaze locked onto them. His hand moved to his earpiece, lips forming commands. "He's made us," Diana warned. "Split up," Frank decided. "Diana, you and Ethan take the evidence to Rachel. Margaret and I will lead them away." This time, Margaret didn't argue. She embraced her son quickly. "Trust Frank's sister. I'll find you." Ethan clutched her briefly, displaying vulnerability for the first time. "Promise. Promise." She pressed her father's pocket watch into his hand. "Keep this safe." As Diana and Ethan disappeared into the crowd, Frank led Margaret toward a commercial parking garage. "Victor will have people watching transportation hubs," he said. "We need alternate transport." "I know someone who can help," Margaret replied. "If we can reach her." They entered the parking garage, moving quickly between vehicles. Frank spotted a service elevator, holding it open for Margaret. "Who's this contact?" he asked as they ascended. "Dr. Eliza Forrester, the EPA investigator I mentioned. She has a research vessel in Puget Sound." "A boat." Frank considered this. "Could work. Victor's focus will be on airports and roadblocks." The elevator opened at the 4th level. They stepped out cautiously, but the sound of footsteps immediately sent them ducking behind a concrete pillar. "They're tracking us somehow," Frank whispered, checking Margaret for possible transmitters. "My phone," she realized suddenly. Pacific Energy developed the security software. Even in airplane mode, Victor could track it. Frank took her phone, removed the battery, and dropped both into a passing maintenance cart. "Now we need transportation," he said, scanning the parked vehicles. Margaret pointed to a service van with a landscaping company logo. "That type usually keeps keys inside for workers." "AOR," Frank gave her an appreciative look. "You're full of surprises, Dr. Harrington." "I didn't spend 15 years with Victor without learning a few things," she replied grimly. The van was indeed unlocked, keys tucked above the visor. Frank started it as Margaret slid into the passenger seat. "Head for Shills Hole Marina," she directed. "I can contact Eliza from there." As they exited the garage, Frank caught sight of black Suburbans converging on the building they just left. "Victor's mobilizing everything he has," he observed, navigating carefully through downtown traffic. "He knows what we found." Margaret stared out at the Seattle skyline, her father's legacy and its terrible secrets now in her hands. "All these years," she said quietly, "I thought I was paranoid, that maybe Victor was right, and I was seeing conspiracies where there were just business decisions." "That's how abusers work," Frank replied, his eyes on the road. "They make you doubt your own perception until their reality becomes yours." "How did you know?" "My sister specialized in domestic abuse cases before moving to corporate crime. Said they were surprisingly similar power dynamics, control tactics." Margaret was silent for a moment. "I never thought I'd be that woman. The one who stays, the one who makes excuses." "You didn't stay," Frank pointed out. "You fought back. You protected your son." "Not soon enough," her voice caught. "If I'd been braver sooner, maybe Harrison would still be alive." Frank navigated onto the highway, keeping their speed exactly at the limit to avoid attention. "Victor is responsible for Senator Frost's death," he said firmly. "Just like he's responsible for the Carson Air victims. Just like he's responsible for the cancer clusters. Not you." Margaret turned to study him, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. Not just a mechanic who'd given them shelter, but a man who'd carried his own burden of unwarranted guilt for 15 years. "Why did you help us?" she asked. "That night in your shop. You could have called the police. Avoided all this." Frank was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "When I was 10, he finally said, my father took me camping in the Olympics. We got caught in a storm, lost our tent, ended up soaking wet with night coming on. Thought we were done for. Then this old guy appeared on the trail, led us to his cabin, dried us out, fed us, let us sleep on his floor. He navigated around a slow-moving truck. Next morning, I asked my dad why a stranger would help us like that. Dad said, "Son, some storms you can't outrun. When that happens, all that matters is who opens their door to you." Frank glanced at her briefly. "When you showed up that night, I recognized the look. You were in a storm you couldn't outrun." The simple honesty of his answer touched something in Margaret that Victor's calculated charm never had. "Thank you," she said softly, "for opening your door." They drove in companionable silence until the marina came into view, sailboat masts swaying gently against the backdrop of Puget Sound. "We made it," Margaret said, relief evident in her voice. "Don't celebrate yet," Frank cautioned, scanning the parking area. "Too many access points, not enough cover." He parked at the far end of the lot, giving them a clear view of the approaches. "Eliza's vessel is the Horizon Seeker," Margaret said. "Berth 42. If we can get to it, we have a chance." Frank assessed their options. "We'll need to move openly, like we belong. Any disguises in this van?" A search of the back revealed landscaping coveralls and work caps. They quickly pulled them on over their clothes. "Stay casual. Act like we're supposed to be here," Frank instructed as they started toward the marina, carrying hedge trimmers and pruning shears from the van to complete their cover. They were halfway to the docks when Frank spotted a black Suburban turning into the lot. "Keep walking," he murmured. "Don't look back." The Suburban cruised slowly through the parking area, James Reed visible at the wheel. "How did they find us?" Margaret whispered. "Someone at the marina might be watching for you," Frank theorized. "A regular contact Victor knows about." They reached the marina gate, requiring keycard access. Margaret hesitated. "Service entrance," Frank directed, nodding toward a maintenance gate nearby where a dock worker was unloading supplies. They approached casually, Frank engaging the worker in conversation about landscape maintenance, while Margaret slipped past. Frank followed moments later, tools in hand, as if heading to a scheduled job. The docks stretched before them, hundreds of vessels bobbing in their slips. Margaret led the way confidently, scanning berth numbers. "Almost there," she said as they passed berth 38. That's when gunfire erupted behind them. James Reed had spotted them from the parking area and was advancing rapidly, pistol in hand. "Run!" Frank shoved Margaret forward, using his body to shield her as they sprinted down the dock. Bullets splintered wood around them as Reed closed the distance, his marksman's aim hampered only by their erratic movement. There, Margaret pointed to a research vessel with Horizon Seeker emblazoned on its stern. A woman appeared on deck, alerted by the commotion. She took one look at the situation and immediately started the engines. "Eliza," Margaret called. "It's Victor." Dr. Forrester needed no further explanation. She grabbed a boat hook, extending it toward them as they reached the slip. "Jump!" she commanded. Margaret leapt first, catching the hook and being pulled aboard. Frank turned to face Reed, buying her time. Reed slowed his approach, weapon raised. "Nothing personal, Reynolds. Just business." 172 people, Frank replied, voice deadly calm. "Was that just business too?" A flicker of confusion crossed Reed's face. "What?" "Carson Air Flight 677. Victor's handiwork." Reed's aim wavered slightly. "That was an accident." "Tell that to the families," Frank said, noticing the Horizon Seeker's engines throttling up behind him. "Tell that to the children who lost parents." Something shifted in Reed's cold eyes, not compassion, but calculation. "How much do you know?" "Everything. Maxwell Harrington documented it all." Reed processed this, professional instincts warring with new information. "Prove it." "Jump," Margaret called from the vessel, now pulling away from the dock. Frank backed toward the edge. "Your employer is going down." "Reed." "How much is he paying you to go down with him?" Without waiting for an answer, Frank turned and dove into the space between dock and vessel, swimming powerfully despite his age. Margaret and Dr. Forrester hauled him aboard as bullets stitched the water around him. From the dock, James Reed watched the research vessel accelerate toward open water, his expression unreadable. Instead of continuing to fire, he lowered his weapon and spoke into his communications device. Aboard the Horizon Seeker, Frank coughed up seawater as Margaret wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "That was either very brave or very stupid," Dr. Forrester observed. A tall woman in her 50s with weathered features and no-nonsense demeanor. "Probably both," Frank admitted, recovering his breath. "Thank you for the rescue." "Don't thank me yet," she replied grimly, pointing toward the marina entrance where two Coast Guard vessels were deploying. Victor's reach extends to maritime enforcement. Margaret joined them at the rail, watching the pursuit take shape. "Can we outrun them?" "Not a chance," Dr. Forrester said. "But we don't need to." She gestured toward the horizon, where a bank of dense fog was rolling in from the Pacific. Sometimes nature provides better cover than technology. As the Horizon Seeker cut through the waters of Puget Sound, Frank thought about the evidence now in Diana's possession. The truth about Carson Air finally coming to light, and the woman standing beside him no longer running from her abuser, but sailing directly into the storm to reclaim her father's legacy. The real battle was just beginning. Fog blanketed Puget Sound, transforming the water into a ghostly plain where visibility extended barely 20 yards in any direction. Aboard the Horizon Seeker, Dr. Eliza Forrester navigated with the confidence of someone who knew these waters intimately, relying more on memory and instruments than sight. "Coast Guard's still searching the Eastern Shipping Channel," she reported, studying the radar display. "They're assuming we're making for the San Juans." "But we're not," Frank surmised, noting their heading. "Olympic Peninsula," Eliza confirmed. "I have a research station near Nia Bay. Off-grid, minimal digital footprint." Margaret emerged from below decks, having changed into dry clothes. The borrowed outfit, waterproof pants, and a faded University of Washington sweatshirt made her look more like a graduate student than the heir to an energy empire. "Any word from Diana?" she asked. Frank shook his head. "Communications blackout until we reach the station. Safer that way. Ethan will be worried." "Your son struck me as remarkably capable," Frank observed. "He gets that from you, not Victor." A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "Victor always complained Ethan was too much like my father, too interested in how things worked rather than how to profit from them." Eliza adjusted their course slightly. "Speaking of your father, what exactly did you find in that trust vault that has Victor unleashing private military contractors?" Margaret hesitated, glancing at Frank, who nodded encouragement. "Evidence that Victor sabotaged Carson Air Flight 677, she said quietly, "along with documentation of systematic environmental violations and corporate espionage." Eliza's weathered hands tightened on the wheel. "I lost 2 colleagues on that flight. They were heading to investigate the Anacortes facility. My father knew," Margaret continued. "He was building a case against Victor before his death. The trust contained his evidence, including sworn testimony. And Victor's been trying to bury it for 15 years, Frank added. Eliza guided the vessel through a narrow channel, the fog providing perfect cover for their approach to the peninsula. "Margaret, I need to ask this directly," she said, her scientific precision evident in her tone. "Did Victor kill your father?" The question hung in the air, made more ominous by the surrounding fog. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "The official cause was heart failure, but the timing, too convenient," Frank finished. "Just like Senator Frost's death." The research station appeared through the mist, a weathered structure built on stilts over a rocky shoreline, solar panels gleaming dully on its roof. A small dock extended into deeper water, allowing the Horizon Seeker to moor directly alongside. "Home sweet home," Eliza said, cutting the engines. "At least temporarily." Inside, the station was Spartan but functional scientific equipment, sharing space with living quarters designed for extended research expeditions. Large windows faced the open Pacific, though today they revealed only swirling fog. "Communications are satellite-based," Eliza explained, activating a secure terminal. bounced through 3 university servers before reaching outside networks. Not impossible to trace, but it would take resources even Victor might struggle to muster. Frank examined the station's security measures with professional interest. Military-grade motion sensors, reinforced doors. This isn't standard research equipment. Eliza's expression hardened. After the Port Gardner Bay investigation was shut down, I received threats, decided I wouldn't be caught unprepared again. Can we contact Diana and Ethan? Margaret asked. We can try the secure channel, Eliza said, typing commands into the system. But we should be brief. The connection established, showing Diana's face on the monitor. She appeared to be in a nondescript room, tension evident in her expression. Thank God, she said when she saw them. We've been worried. We're safe, Margaret assured her. Is Ethan with you? The boy appeared beside Diana, relief washing over his features. Mom, are you okay? We saw reports about gunfire at the marina. I'm fine, and sweetheart. Frank made sure of that. Margaret leaned closer to the screen. Did you get the evidence somewhere safe? Diana nodded. Rachel secured it in an evidence lockup under a different case number. Victor can't access it without knowing where to look. What about Walter Brookfield? Frank asked. Diana's expression grew somber. He's alive, but hospitalized. Fell down the stairs at Cambridge Trust during the evacuation. Victor's people, Margaret said grimly. Almost certainly, but unprovable. The good news is we've completed preliminary authentication of your father's evidence. It's legitimate. Margaret, and the trust provisions, Margaret pressed. If we can prove Victor violated the environmental covenants, control of Pacific Energy reverts to you, Diana confirmed. But we need to move quickly. Victor's frozen all Harrington family assets he can access. He's also filed for emergency psychological evaluation, claiming you're suffering from paranoid delusions. Frank wasn't surprised. Setting the stage to discredit anything she might reveal. There's more, Ethan interjected. I've been monitoring Dad's communications. He's activated something called Operation Landfall. That's not in any of the files we recovered, Margaret said, alarmed. Because it's new, Ethan explained. Created 3 weeks ago, right after you started gathering evidence for your escape. Eliza leaned into frame. What exactly is Operation Landfall? I don't know specifics, Ethan admitted, but it involves the Anacortes facility and something called Total Containment Protocol. Frank and Margaret exchanged worried glances. He's covering his tracks, Frank said, destroying evidence at the facility that could corroborate Maxwell's claims. But the Anacortes facility employs hundreds of people, Margaret protested. Victor wouldn't care, Diana said bluntly. Not if his freedom's at stake. The satellite connection began breaking up, interference patterns disrupting the image. We're losing you, Frank warned. Meet us at Diana's voice cut out as the connection failed completely. Eliza frowned at the terminal. That wasn't normal signal degradation. Someone's actively jamming satellite communications in this area. A chill ran through the room as the implication sank in. How quickly can we move? Frank asked, already heading for the window to scan the surroundings. The Horizon Seeker needs at least 20 minutes to refuel, Eliza replied, powering down the terminal. We don't have 20 minutes, Frank said, pointing to a faint light visible through the fog. That's a searchlight pattern, methodical sweep, standard search grid. Margaret joined him at the window. Coast Guard. No, Frank said grimly. Their patterns would be wider, designed for rescue. This is a tactical search. Someone knows we're in this vicinity. The satellite trace, Eliza realized. They triangulated our position from the communication. How long did we broadcast? Frank asked. 3 minutes, 17 seconds. Then we have maybe 10 minutes before they pinpoint our location. Frank was already moving, gathering essential supplies. Is there another way out besides the Horizon Seeker? Eliza hesitated, then moved to a locked cabinet. There's an emergency route through the sea caves below. The local tribe used them for centuries to evade detection during tribal conflicts. She retrieved a waterproof case containing maps, flashlights, and emergency supplies. The caves connect to a Forest Service road 2 miles inland, she explained. I keep a vehicle there for emergencies. What about you? Margaret asked. I'll create a diversion with the Horizon Seeker, Eliza said firmly. Make them think we're all aboard, heading back out to sea. They'll catch you, Frank protested. Eventually, yes. But I'm just a researcher who offered shelter to an old colleague. Eliza's smile was determined. Nothing illegal about that. Margaret embraced the older woman. I can't ask you to do this. You didn't ask, Eliza replied. Besides, I've been waiting 15 years to help take Victor Caldwell down. This is my part. A distant engine sound carried through the fog, growing steadily closer. Time to move, Frank urged. Eliza led them to a concealed trapdoor in the station floor. Below, a narrow metal ladder descended to a rocky shelf just above the waterline. Follow the blue markers, she instructed, handing Frank a waterproof flashlight. The tide's going out, so the route should be clear. Don't stop until you reach the forest. Frank went first, testing the ladder's stability before helping Margaret down. As Eliza prepared to close the trapdoor, Margaret looked up at her one last time. Thank you, she said simply. Prove Victor's guilt, Eliza replied. That's all the thanks I need. The trapdoor closed, plunging them into near darkness, broken only by Frank's flashlight beam. The cave smelled of seaweed and salt, the distant boom of waves echoing through stone passages carved by millennia of tidal action. This way, Frank said, spotting the first blue marker painted on the rock wall. They moved as quickly as the treacherous footing allowed, scrambling over slick boulders and through narrow passages. Above, they heard the faint sound of the Horizon Seeker's engine starting up, then fading as Eliza took the vessel out into the foggy sound. After nearly 30 minutes of difficult progress, the cave began to slope upward, the air growing fresher. Finally, they emerged into a dense forest, the fog less oppressive beneath the towering pines. There, Frank pointed to a barely visible trail leading deeper into the woods. They followed it in silence, alert for any signs of pursuit, until they reached a small clearing containing a weathered Jeep Cherokee concealed beneath camouflage netting. Keys, Margaret asked. Frank checked above the visor, finding nothing. Then under the floor mat. Got them! The Jeep started on the first try, its engine well maintained despite its age. Frank navigated carefully along the Forest Service road, keeping their speed moderate to avoid attention. Where are we going? Margaret asked. We've lost contact with Diana and Ethan. Frank considered their limited options. We need to get to Anacortes. If Victor's implementing some kind of total containment protocol, people could be in danger. But that's exactly where he'll expect us to go, Margaret pointed out, which is why we'll need help. Frank pulled out a battered flip phone he'd taken from Eliza's emergency kit. Someone Victor won't be watching. He dialed a number from memory, waiting through several rings before a gruff voice answered. Chen. Commander, it's Frank Reynolds. A pause. This line isn't secure. No time for secure lines. We need to get to the Anacortes facility immediately. Victor Caldwell has initiated something called Operation Landfall that may put workers at risk. Where are you now? Olympic Peninsula, heading east. We need transportation that won't be flagged by Victor's people. Rachel considered this. I can have something waiting at the Port Angeles ferry terminal. South parking lot, 30 minutes. We'll be there, Frank confirmed, ending the call. Margaret studied him. You trust her? I trust that she wants Victor even more than we do, Frank replied. Her daughter's health issues are directly linked to Pacific Energy's chemical dumping. They reached Port Angeles with minutes to spare, finding an unmarked police cruiser waiting in the designated location. Rachel Chen leaned against it, alone, her expression professionally neutral until she confirmed no one had followed them. Diana and Ethan are secure, she said as they approached. But Victor's escalating. He's issued a statement claiming Margaret suffers from bipolar disorder with paranoid features. exacerbated by her father's recent death. My father died 15 years ago, Margaret said incredulously. Exactly. He's gaslighting on a public scale, creating a narrative where your perception of time and events is fundamentally distorted. Rachel opened the cruiser's rear door. I've got protective vests in the back. Put them on. As they complied, Rachel continued briefing them. Victor's private security now has official clearance to assist in finding you. Under the guise of a family medical emergency, they've established checkpoints on major routes to Seattle. What about Anna Cordes? Frank asked, securing his vest. That's where it gets interesting. Pacific Energy declared a preventative safety lockdown of the facility 3 hours ago. No one in or out, supposedly due to a potential equipment malfunction. That's not standard protocol, Margaret noted, her expertise in industrial safety evident. Potential malfunctions require evacuation, not lockdown. Exactly, Rachel agreed, which is why I've requested EPA oversight, citing potential environmental hazards. They've been stonewalled. How quickly can we get there? Frank asked as they got into the cruiser. 4 hours avoiding main highways, Rachel said, starting the engine. But we won't be going in through the front gate. Twilight shrouded the Anacortes facility in unnatural stillness. From their vantage point on a wooded ridge overlooking the complex, Frank studied the perimeter through night vision binoculars. Security's been doubled, he reported. Armed personnel at all access points. Thermal imaging sweeps every 15 minutes. Those aren't regular Pacific Energy security, Rachel observed. Private contractors, probably ex-military. Just like at Cambridge Trust, Margaret added grimly. The facility sprawled across nearly a mile of coastline, its maze of pipes, storage tanks, and processing units illuminated by industrial lighting. Despite the supposed safety lockdown, there was no sign of the emergency response vehicles that should accompany a genuine equipment malfunction. Something's wrong, Margaret said, her scientific training registering the anomalies. The emergency flare system is active, but the personnel evacuation protocols haven't been initiated. Frank handed her the binoculars. What about those tanker trucks near the western perimeter? Margaret focused on the vehicle's 6 large tankers positioned near an auxiliary loading dock, their engines idling. Those aren't regular transport vehicles, she said after a moment. They're specialized containment units, designed for hazardous materials too unstable for pipeline transport. They're removing evidence, Rachel concluded, physical evidence of whatever was being produced or stored here that violated environmental regulations. Frank checked his watch. Diana and Ethan should be in position by now. Their plan, hastily constructed during the drive to Anacortes, was dangerously simple, while Frank, Margaret, and Rachel approached from the northern ridge. Diana and Ethan would access the facility's monitoring systems through a maintenance substation on the southern perimeter. We need eyes inside before we move, Rachel said, especially with civilian workers potentially still in there. Margaret's phone, a secure device provided by Rachel, vibrated with an incoming message. It's Ethan, she reported. They're in position, but the substation security has been upgraded. He needs time to bypass it. How much time? Frank asked. 20 minutes, minimum. Rachel frowned. Those tankers will be gone by then. Frank studied the facility layout again, his engineer's mind calculating angles and access points. There's another way, he said, pointing to a maintenance access tunnel running beneath the main processing area. That tunnel connects to the environmental monitoring station. Standard design allows for sensor replacement without disrupting operations. How do you know that? Rachel asked, surprised. Because I designed a similar system for Boeing's fuel storage facilities, Frank replied. Basic infrastructure hasn't changed much in 15 years. Margaret checked the facility schematics on her tablet. He's right. The tunnel terminates directly beneath the central monitoring hub, which means we could access the internal systems without waiting for Ethan to hack in from outside. Rachel reasoned. Exactly, Frank confirmed. But the tunnel entrance will be guarded. Rachel checked her service weapon. Leave that to me. They descended the ridge carefully, using the gathering darkness as cover. At the perimeter fence, Rachel led them to a maintenance gate monitored by a single guard. "Wait for my signal," she whispered, then stepped into the open, badge displayed prominently. "Commander Chen, Seattle PD," she announced. "EPA oversight authorization." The guard straightened, clearly not expecting official visitors. "Ma'am, the facility is under lockdown. I can't allow access without clearance from your supervisor," Rachel finished. "That would be Mr. Dennison, correct. He's already approved my inspection team." She gestured toward an official-looking document. "If you'd like to call and confirm, I can wait." The guard hesitated, clearly unwilling to disturb his superiors over what seemed a routine matter. "I'll need to see that authorization." As he stepped forward to examine the document, Frank moved silently behind him. One precise strike to a pressure point, and the guard slumped unconscious. "Oldest trick in the book," Rachel said, catching the guard's radio before it hit the ground. "Still works on underpaid security." They secured the guard in the small security booth, using his key card to access the maintenance gate. Beyond, the maintenance tunnel entrance was concealed behind equipment storage, exactly where Frank had predicted. "Radio check," Rachel said into her secure comm unit. "Diana, do you copy? We're still working on access." Diana's voice came through, strained with effort. "Ethan says the security architecture has been completely rebuilt in the last 24 hours. We're proceeding with alternate entry," Rachel informed her. "Maintain position and be ready to move on my signal." The maintenance tunnel was narrow and dimly lit, designed for utility rather than comfort. They moved in single file, Frank leading, Rachel bringing up the rear with her weapon ready. "According to the schematics, we should reach the monitoring hub access in about 200 yards, Margaret said, consulting her tablet. Frank halted suddenly, raising a hand for silence. Ahead, voices echoed faintly through the tunnel. "Don't care about the protocols. Mr. Caldwell wants all research samples contained and transported within the hour. Sir, some of these compounds are unstable. Rushing the containment process could. Your concerns are noted. Proceed as instructed." The voices faded as the speakers moved away from the tunnel. "They're destroying evidence," Margaret whispered, "and risking lives to do it," Frank added grimly. They continued forward more cautiously until reaching a service ladder, leading to a hatch marked Environmental Monitoring, Authorized Personnel Only. Frank climbed first, testing the hatch carefully before easing it open a fraction. The monitoring hub beyond appeared deserted, banks of computers displaying real-time data from throughout the facility. "Clear," he whispered, pushing the hatch fully open and helping Margaret through. The hub was a circular room filled with sophisticated monitoring equipment, its walls lined with screens showing chemical composition readings, temperature fluctuations, and containment integrity measurements from every section of the facility. Margaret moved immediately to the central console, her scientific expertise evident as she navigated the complex systems. "They've overridden the automated safety protocols," she reported, alarm growing in her voice. "Containment integrity in sections 7 through 12 is being deliberately compromised." Frank joined her, studying the displays. "They're purging the evidence, mixing incompatible compounds to destroy the original chemical signatures. But that creates highly volatile reactions," Margaret protested. "The resulting compounds could be even more dangerous." Rachel checked the personnel deployment screens. "There are still at least 60 workers in those sections. Why haven't they been evacuated?" Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing protected files. "Because they don't know what's happening. Look, the internal alarm systems have been disabled in those sections." Frank's expression darkened. Victor's willing to risk a catastrophic accident to cover his tracks. "Not just an accident," Margaret said, her voice hollow as she pulled up an internal memo. "A controlled release. Operation Landfall includes contingency plans for a regrettable industrial incident that would destroy all evidence while providing appropriate narrative control." The implications struck them simultaneously. "He's planning to sacrifice his own workers," Rachel said, horrified. And blame it on equipment failure, Frank added. Possibly even on Margaret's sabotage. Margaret was already accessing the emergency systems. I'm reinstating the automated safety protocols and activating the evacuation alarms. Won't Victor's people just override them again? Rachel asked. Not if I lock them out first, Margaret replied, her fingers never pausing. My father built backdoor administrative access into all Pacific Energy systems. Victor never found them all. Alarms began blaring throughout the facility as emergency lighting bathed the complex in pulsing red. On the monitors, they watched workers in the affected sections responding to the unexpected evacuation order. They're moving, Frank confirmed. But those containment failures are accelerating. We don't have much time. Rachel activated her comm unit. Diana, Ethan, evacuation is underway. Move to extraction point Alpha. No response came. Diana, do you copy? Rachel repeated urgently. Static filled the channel briefly before a familiar voice responded. Not Diana's, but Victor Caldwell's. Commander Chen, he said smoothly, I see you've exceeded your jurisdictional authority again, and with such interesting companions. Frank and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances as Victor continued. Margaret, darling, your physicians are quite concerned about this latest episode. Thankfully, I've located young Ethan. He's safe with me now. Margaret lunged for the comm unit. Victor, if you hurt him, I would never harm my son. Victor interrupted, his tone wounded. Unlike you, who's dragging him into your paranoid conspiracy theories. Where's Diana? Frank demanded. Ms. Reynolds is experiencing some health difficulties. Her lupus, I believe, stress can be so aggravating for autoimmune conditions. Rachel keyed a private channel on her police radio, summoning backup. But Victor laughed. Don't bother with reinforcements. Commander, the road access has been temporarily compromised. Infrastructure failure so common in these rural areas. On the monitoring screens, they watched security teams converging on the hub's location. You have approximately 3 minutes before my security team reaches you, Victor informed them. I suggest you surrender peacefully, for Ethan's sake, if nothing else. The communication cut off abruptly. He's bluffing, Frank said, though uncertainty tinged his voice. Diana wouldn't let them take Ethan easily. Unless they had no choice, Rachel countered grimly. We need to move. Now. Margaret remained at the console, fingers flying across keys. Almost done. I'm transferring all the monitoring data to an external server the EPA maintains. Leave it, Frank urged. We can't help Ethan if we're captured. 30 more seconds, Margaret insisted. This is the evidence we need, proof of what they've been producing here. Proof of what killed those people in Farrington Cove. Frank relented, standing guard at the door while Rachel checked the tunnel entrance. The facility evacuation continued, workers streaming toward emergency exits, unaware of the drama unfolding in the monitoring hub. Transfer complete, Margaret announced, activating one final command sequence. And I've locked the emergency protocols. They can't override the evacuation now. A thunderous boom shook the building, followed by a series of secondary explosions. That wasn't supposed to happen, Margaret said, alarmed. The containment protocols should have prevented. Victor's accelerating the timeline, Frank realized, creating his regrettable incident now, while he can still blame it on us. Rachel pushed the door open, weapon ready. Main corridors clear. We need to reach the north emergency exit. They moved swiftly through the emptying facility, the air growing acrid with chemical smoke. Workers rushed past them, coughing and disoriented, following emergency lighting toward safety. Head count, Frank called to a passing floor supervisor. Is everyone out? Can't confirm, the man shouted over the alarms. Communication systems down. Another explosion rocked the building. Closer this time, ceiling panels crashed down around them as sprinkler systems activated, creating a chaotic deluge. This way, Margaret directed. her knowledge of the facility layout proving invaluable. They turned a corner and found themselves face to face with James Reed and two security operatives. Weapons drawn. "End of the line," Reed said calmly, as if they were meeting at a business conference rather than in a failing industrial complex. Rachel raised her service weapon. "Police, drop your weapons." Reed seemed almost amused. "Commander, you're outnumbered and outgunned, and in about 4 minutes, this section of the facility will experience catastrophic containment failure. I suggest we all leave together, peacefully." Frank studied Reed's expression, noting the absence of the cold determination he'd displayed at the marina. Something had changed. "You've seen the evidence," Frank guessed. "You know what Victor's doing." A barely perceptible nod confirmed his suspicion. "Victor has my nephew," Frank pressed. "And my sister." "I'm aware," Reed replied, his tone revealing nothing. "The boy is unharmed." "And Diana?" Frank demanded. Reed's silence was answer enough. Margaret stepped forward, ignoring the weapons trained on her. "You're a professional, Mr. Reed. You follow orders, but you have a code. Victor's breaking his own code, sacrificing innocent workers, threatening a child." The facility shuddered again, structural integrity warnings blaring through the emergency system. "We're out of time," Reed said abruptly, lowering his weapon slightly. "North emergency exit is blocked by the containment failure. You'll need to take the maintenance tunnel back out." Rachel kept her weapon steady. "Why should we trust you? Because I just received orders to ensure none of you leave this facility alive." Reed replied matter-of-factly. "Orders I find problematic." Frank made a decision. "Lead the way." Reed nodded to his men, who lowered their weapons reluctantly. "Secondary extraction route. Move." They followed Reed through increasingly smoke-filled corridors, the facility groaning around them as systems failed. Workers had largely evacuated, leaving an eerie emptiness broken only by flashing emergency lights and automated warnings. "Victor's at the executive helipad," Reed informed them as they navigated a maintenance passage. "With the boy." "And Diana," Frank pressed. "Medical transport, en route to Seattle." "Is she alive?" Frank's voice cracked slightly. Reed nodded. "But in serious condition, some kind of seizure, apparently triggered by a compound found only in this facility." Margaret's face hardened. "He poisoned her." "I cannot confirm that," Reed replied carefully. "But the timing was convenient." They reached the maintenance tunnel access, the air clearer here as the facility's environmental systems struggled to contain the spreading contamination. "This will take you to the south perimeter," Reed said, opening the access hatch. "Emergency response vehicles are staging there." Frank hesitated. "Why help us now?" Reed's professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing something almost human beneath. 172 people on Carson Air," he said quietly. "I don't mind wet work, but I don't kill civilians, especially not children." Another explosion, much closer, sent them stumbling. "Go," Reed ordered. "I'll delay the security team." As they entered the tunnel, Frank turned back one last time. "Victor will know you helped us." Reed checked his weapon with practiced efficiency. "Victor has larger problems now." The EPA just breached the North Gate with a federal warrant, responding to evidence of imminent environmental catastrophe. "What evidence?" Rachel asked. Surprised, Reed's smile was cold. "The evidence Dr. Harrington just transmitted from the monitoring hub. Apparently someone anonymously forwarded it to every environmental regulatory agency in the state." Understanding dawned on Frank's face. "You've been playing both sides." "I've been ensuring my exit strategy," Reed corrected. "Now go, before we all become part of Victor's regrettable incident." They didn't need further encouragement, descending into the tunnel as the facility continued to deteriorate above them. The journey back seemed longer, each step taking them further from Ethan but closer to potential safety. When they finally emerged at the south perimeter, chaos reigned. Emergency vehicles surrounded the facility, hazmat teams deploying while medical personnel treated evacuated workers. In the distance, news helicopters circled, capturing footage of smoke billowing from multiple structures. Commander Chen, a uniformed officer, spotted them, rushing over. "We've been looking for you." EPA's established an incident command post on the east side. "I need a secure line to Seattle PD. Immediately," Rachel ordered, "and locate the Pacific Energy Executive Helipad." "Ma'am, all air traffic has been grounded within 10 miles due to potential airborne contamination." Margaret and Frank exchanged hopeful glances. If Victor couldn't fly out. "The helipad," Frank pressed. "Where is it?" The officer pointed toward an elevated structure on the facility's administrative wing, the only section not yet affected by the growing disaster. "There," Margaret said, spotting movement. "That's Victor's security detail." Through the smoke and emergency lighting, they could make out figures hurrying across the helipad. One small figure, clearly Ethan, was being escorted by larger men in tactical gear. "They're evacuating him overland," Frank realized. "Probably have vehicles waiting beyond the emergency perimeter." Rachel was already mobilizing a response team, but Margaret touched her arm. "No," she said firmly. "This is between Victor and me now." "Margaret, you can't," Frank began. "I can and I will," she interrupted. "He's using my son as leverage. That ends today." Before they could stop her, Margaret commandeered an emergency response vehicle, driving directly toward the administrative wing. Frank cursed, then jumped into another vehicle to follow. The facility was deteriorating rapidly now, secondary explosions sending shockwaves across the complex. Margaret navigated through the chaos with single-minded determination. Years of subjugation transformed into focused rage. She abandoned the vehicle at the administrative building's entrance, racing inside against the flow of evacuating personnel. The building remained largely intact, its systems designed to withstand nearby industrial incidents. Frank caught up to her at the executive elevator bank. "Margaret, wait. We need a plan." "I have a plan," she replied, overriding the emergency lockdown with her father's access codes. "I'm going to get my son back." The elevator responded, doors sliding open to reveal an ornate cabin designed for corporate VIPs. As they ascended to the helipad level, Margaret turned to Frank. "I need you to trust me," she said quietly. "Victor responds to strength, not negotiation. He needs to see that I'm not afraid anymore." Frank recognized the steel in her voice, the same determination that had led her to build a case against her husband, despite the risks, to protect her son at any cost. "I'm with you," he said simply. "Whatever you need." The elevator opened onto a plush executive suite, designed for receiving important visitors arriving by helicopter. Beyond glass doors, the helipad stood illuminated against the night sky, Victor's security team making final preparations for departure. Margaret strode directly onto the helipad, Frank following closely. Victor stood with his back to them, issuing instructions to his head of security while Ethan watched silently, his young face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "Victor." Margaret's voice carried over the facility alarms and distant explosions. He turned slowly, unsurprised by her appearance. At 52, Victor Caldwell embodied corporate power expensively tailored even in crisis, his handsome features arranged in an expression of paternal concern. "Margaret," he acknowledged smoothly, "I'm relieved you're safe. This unfortunate incident has already claimed too many lives." "Save the performance," she replied coldly. "The EPA has the monitoring data. They know exactly what happened here." Victor signaled his security team to stand down as they reached for weapons. "Data can be interpreted many ways," he said with practiced reasonableness. "Industrial accidents are complex, and investigations take years. By then, public interest will have moved on." Ethan tried to move toward his mother, but a security operative held him firmly in place. "Let him go," Margaret demanded. "Our son is coming with me to our Zurich residence," Victor replied. "For his safety and well-being. You're welcome to join us. Of course, after you've received appropriate medical care." Frank positioned himself strategically, assessing the security team 4 operatives, professionally trained but clearly uncomfortable with the deteriorating situation around them. The facility is reaching critical failure, Frank warned. This location won't be safe for long, which is why we're leaving immediately, Victor responded, barely acknowledging him. Margaret, it's time to end this misguided crusade. Come with us. We can discuss everything once we're safe. Margaret took another step forward. I found my father's legacy trust. Victor, I know about Carson Air. I know about the cancer clusters in Farrington Cove. I know everything. For the first time, Victor's perfect composure faltered slightly. Unfortunate incidents, all of them. He recovered quickly, but without credible evidence linking Pacific Energy directly. I have the evidence, Margaret interrupted. All of it, including my father's deposition taken before his death, detailing how you systematically undermine environmental safeguards for profit. Victor's facade cracked further. Maxwell was confused toward the end. Heart medication affecting his cognitive. Stop lying, Ethan suddenly shouted, wrenching free from his captor's momentary lapse of attention. I heard you on the phone. You said grandfather had to be handled because he was going to expose everything. The boy's outburst created the distraction Frank needed. In one fluid motion, he disarmed the nearest security operative, using the man's momentum to send him sprawling. Chaos erupted on the helipad. Victor lunged for Ethan, but Margaret intercepted him, years of suppressed rage fueling her strength as she drove him backward. You will never touch my son again, she hissed. Frank engaged the remaining security team, his military training evident as he neutralized 2 operatives in rapid succession. The 4th man, assessing the changing dynamics, wisely backed away, hands raised. Victor recovered his balance. Corporate mask completely gone now, replaced by cold fury. You ungrateful bitch, he snarled. I made you. Without me, you'd be nothing but Maxwell's forgotten first mistake. Margaret laughed, the sound genuinely amused. That's where you're wrong. Victor, I was never nothing. I was a brilliant researcher who discovered evidence of your environmental crimes. I was the daughter Maxwell trusted with his legacy. I was the mother who protected her son from becoming a monster like you. The facility shuddered violently beneath them, a massive explosion from the processing area sending tremors through the structure. This building won't last much longer, Frank warned, gathering Ethan behind him. We need to evacuate now. Victor's expression shifted to calculation. This isn't over, Margaret. One phone call and your precious evidence disappears. One statement about your mental health history and you lose custody permanently. Try it, Margaret challenged. The trust provisions have already been activated. My father's shares vote with me now, not you. The board receives full disclosure of your activities within 24 hours. For the first time, genuine fear flashed across Victor's face. You're bluffing, he said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Maxwell Harrington taught me many things, Margaret replied. Most importantly, he taught me to always have a contingency plan. Another explosion rocked the building, more violent than before. Structural warnings blared through the emergency system as the helipad began to tilt slightly. We need to go, Frank urged, one arm around Ethan. Victor glanced at his abandoned security team, at the emergency vehicles surrounding the facility, at the EPA Incident Command Center clearly visible in the distance. His options were rapidly disappearing. This isn't over, he repeated, backing toward the executive elevator. Actually, it is, said a new voice. They turned to find Rachel Chen standing at the helipad entrance, weapon drawn, flanked by federal agents in EPA windbreakers. Victor Caldwell, you're under arrest for environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit industrial sabotage, she announced formally. Victor's eyes darted around frantically, seeking an escape route that no longer existed. You have no jurisdiction here, he attempted, corporate authority reflexively asserting itself. My attorneys will. Your attorneys are currently responding to federal warrants at Pacific Energy headquarters. Rachel interrupted. The evidence Dr. Harrington transmitted from the monitoring hub has been authenticated by 3 independent laboratories. It's over. Victor. As federal agents moved to take him into custody, Victor locked eyes with Margaret one last time. You'll regret this, he promised quietly. Some messes can't be cleaned up. Margaret, some chemicals never stop spreading. Is that a threat? Frank demanded, stepping forward. Victor's smile was chilling. Merely an observation from someone who understands how these things work. Dead senators tell no tales. After all, the implication hung in the air as agents led him away. Margaret gathered Ethan in her arms, holding him tightly as if to physically protect him from Victor's words. Is it really over, Mom? The boy asked, his composure finally cracking to reveal the frightened child beneath. The immediate danger is, she assured him, smoothing his hair. But we have work to do to make things right. Frank joined them, placing a steadying hand on Margaret's shoulder as the building continued to deteriorate around them. Diana, he asked Rachel quietly. Stable, she replied. The doctors identified the compound in her system. They're administering the antidote now. Relief washed over his weathered features. And Reed disappeared in the chaos, Rachel reported, but not before providing a sworn statement about Victor's involvement in Senator Frost's assassination. As they evacuated the failing structure, Margaret kept Ethan close, one arm around his shoulders while her other hand found Frank's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Outside, the full scale of the disaster was becoming apparent. The Anna Cordes facility, once Pacific Energy's crowning achievement, now burned against the night sky. Emergency responders fighting to contain the contamination Victor had been willing to unleash to protect his secrets. What happens now? Ethan asked, watching the flames reflect against low clouds. Margaret looked at Frank, then back to her son. We rebuild. We make amends to the people who were harmed. We create something better from what's been broken. Frank squeezed her hand gently. Together. As dawn broke over Puget Sound, illuminating the aftermath of Victor Caldwell's final desperate act, Margaret Harrington stood not as a victim or a fugitive, but as her father's true heir ready to transform an empire built on corruption into a force for healing. The storm had passed, but the real work was just beginning. The sea doesn't forget what's buried in its depths. Rain hammers against metal as an aging mechanic works alone in his shop. The ghosts of 172 souls still haunting his dreams 15 years after they plummeted from the sky. He couldn't save them then. The truth died with them, swallowed by corporate power and perfect lies. Until tonight, headlights cut through the downpour. A woman stumbles from a shattered luxury SUV, blood on her forehead, a teenage boy clutching her hand. In her eyes, the desperate calculation of prey that's run out of options. Behind them, black government-plated vehicles prowl the storm-swept roads. Please, she whispers, her refined voice barely audible above the thunder. They're right behind us. Some storms you run from. Others, you stand and face. And sometimes, the most dangerous waters are the ones that appear perfectly still, hiding corruption deep enough to poison generations, and secrets deadly enough to bring down an empire.